Hello and welcome to Nightmare Tonight. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Tonight, I have with me John, the LitCritGuy. I think we had a great conversation. I will have links to all of John's work in the video description or the show notes. In particular, I would like to highlight John's recent video about the horror of work. I think we started off by talking about that video and then subsequently went down a number of diverging paths, which, I enjoy. I'm trying to have some more open conversations on here. I should also note that John made a number of references throughout this discussion. If you check out the show notes, you'll see that I have tried to catalog these various references. So I would urge you to check that out if you're interested in the subject matter. And if you enjoy my content and want to support me on a monthly basis, you can do so at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. And all right, without further ado, here is the episode. All right, hello and welcome to Nightmare Tonight. In this episode, I have with me John, the LitCritGuy. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. Very happy to be here.
So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about, I was rewatching your video about work, which is really good. If people haven't seen it, check it out. But yeah, I was rewatching that and kind of lamenting about this this unfortunate fact of life in 2021, which is the necessity for workers, typically, I guess, young professionals, we have to sort of invent our own personal brands, right?
Yeah.
What do you think that does to people in terms of, I don't know, shaping their subjectivity? I feel like it seeps into every aspect of life.
There are two things that I think are really important here, which is constant entrepreneurialism of the self, right? You are no longer an employee, you're a freelance contractor, so you're constantly selling yourself to your employer.
Yep.
If you're a freelance, if you work freelance in any kind of creative industry, that's what you have to do anyway. So there is this constant entrepreneurialism as well as this constant plasticity of self. So you are constant. I don't know if you ever apply for like a whole swathe of jobs. Like, let's say you set aside a weekend or a few days where you're like, I'm going to sit down, I'm just going to bang out these applications.
Yep. Every
application has to be perfectly tailored to every opportunity. You have to kind of remake yourself on the page and so not only do you constantly have to sell something, what you're selling has to be infinitely malleable, so it can be shaped into whatever kind of subject the employer wants. It's like, I'll do anything. Just tell me what you want me to do, and that's what I'll do.
Yeah.
I work in academia as my day job, which has been in many ways the laboratory and testing ground for a lot of the management technique that you see kind of being normalized across the broader economy, which hollows out, union work or stable work or well-paid work and replaces it with this very short-term, very individual-focused, very entrepreneurial and precarious work. So I think what it does is it makes you into a kind of shadow of your former self, right? You become whatever you're told that you should be.
Right.
But what it also does is that it makes you into competition for everybody else who's working for the same job or same area. its aim is to make you a very kind of docile individual subject, this technique, and it's also to kind of erode the possibility of class consciousness, because you can't have solidarity with other people who are or underemployed, or if you're lucky enough to have a job, you can't have solidarity with the people that you work with, because those aren't colleagues anymore, those are competition, because we're all constantly competing for the same set of resources.
Yeah.
Work is exhausting.
Absolutely. You said something there that piqued my interest, which is that academia is sort of the testing ground for a lot of these management strategies, right? That puts you in a tricky position, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in the UK, the last sort of 5 years have seen pretty big strikes from the trade union, which I'm a member of, the University and Colleges Union, ever increasing costs onto very young people coming to university. Some of the biggest rent strikes in UK higher education have been happening this year, where students across multiple, I think around 50 universities, which in the UK, where there are nowhere near as many as there are in the United States, that's a pretty hefty proportion of all universities. There have been rent strikes and rent rebates, because the aim, of course, is not just to create a new kind of worker in the terms of the academics who work in the university. It's to create a new kind of institution that's tailor-made for a neoliberal market. So when you turn students into consumers, that's the other side of the coin of turning academics and professional staff into contingent precariat who will do anything to keep whatever adjunct or poverty level wages they can. So in many ways, this is something that people who've been securely employed in academia have seen coming for a very long time, which is that, you know, if this is what they can do to new people coming into our industry or coming into the profession of trying to teach and trying to do research, this is what's going to happen to the industry, to this profession as a whole. And pretty much that's been borne out. One thing that I don't know what it was, but lots of people on kind of like left YouTube were making videos about work at roughly the same time. So it means that lots of people were reading David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs.
Yep.
I saw Big Joel over on Twitter was reading it, and he said, it's kind of weird that academics talk a lot about forms. They talk an awful lot about paperwork. It's like, we get it. Everybody hates forms. But it's like the purpose of, especially in the UK, the absolute explosion in bureaucracy and administration is to basically make sure that you spend as much time justifying the time that you should be spending on teaching as actually teaching.
Right.
So in effect, administration and support staff in universities has kind of been hollowed out as well. There is no close link now, so everything is kind of put into a centralized system where you have a central administration, and then you have sort of like as spokes on the wheel, you have little hubs where teaching is supposed to happen. So you create a very complex administrative system which has to justify its own existence constantly. So this is why Graeber talks so much about how in academia there is this proliferation of jobs which are not only not very meaningful, but the people that do them know that they're not meaningful.
Yeah, they're fully aware of it.
Yeah, these are the titular bullshit jobs, right? Jobs which don't really make that much of a difference, but kind of just have to be done. And in universities, one of the biggest categories of kind of bullshit jobs is jobs which exist to justify the continued growth of this administrative and costly system. So yeah, academia is a very interesting place to work. It's not a place that I want to work in for any longer than I have to.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I feel the same way about work in general, right? I don't want to work any more than I have to.
Yeah, right.
The bureaucratic mechanism of it in particular, Mark Fisher talks a bit about this, and the term he uses, I think, is probably one of the funniest moments in capitalist realism, is when he calls it market Stalinism.
Yes.
I just laugh out loud every time I read that.
It's gotten more insidious. So there is In UK higher education, for people who might not know this, there is the Research Excellence Framework, which is a national investigation of the quality of the research that's done at every single higher education institution in the country. Mm-hmm. It costs a frankly ludicrous amount of money to do this, but it's directly linked, your success in this exercise is directly linked to the central research funding that you'll be allocated. So what this means is a colossal administrative apparatus has emerged to basically gamify the process. So you have to maximize your returns. There are institutions which will spend their time not researching, but preparing for the research excellence framework to make sure you can maximize the amount of money that you get. There is now the teaching excellence framework as well, which is going to be another enormously costly justification of this, market Stalinization of higher education. And they're thinking of introducing another framework, which is what happens when you let neoliberal right-wingers run education policy in a country for the last dozen years. So, if not longer. So yeah, market Stalinism is something that anyone who works in British higher education will be very familiar with.
It sounds maddening.
It is, yes.
Generally, I think this thought is a bit out of left field, but there is a tendency for people on the left to kind of roll their eyes at the notion of a personal brand. And yet I find we all kind of do it anyway. We all end up sort of creating our own personal brand, even if we reflexively think that's like a horrible way to frame it. And it's one of these things where I increasingly think it's necessary to parse certain actions in the sense of, like, am I doing this because it's financially optimal, or am I trying to help build a better world? I think we're often duped or maybe coerced to the point where we think we're doing the latter when we're actually doing the former.
Oh, completely. I describe Žižek as a problematic fave of mine.
Same.
And he talks about this in the Sublime Object of Ideology, this notion of ideological cynicism, where it's nobody really believes, but you do it anyway.
Yep.
Right? You don't. We all go, well, I don't really think it matters if I have a LinkedIn profile, but we make one anyway because that's what we're told that we have to do. So we allow ourselves the feeling that we are in some sense resistant, whilst at the same time doing exactly what the ideological forces of employers and capital expect and demand of us anyway.
Yeah.
It's a very cynical kind of age that we live in. This idea of genuine passionate attachment to ideas or to concepts or to even something as contested and nebulous as socialism or communism or a post-capitalist future. Fisher talks about it in Capitalist Realism. Do people really want that, or is that just something that we say that we want, whilst at the same time we kind of just go along with the sort of ideological status quo?
Right.
And I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Yeah, I don't think so either. It's one of these things that I constantly grapple with. And I guess my secret fear is that capitalism is so totalizing and all-encompassing that it cannot be overcome at this point. And we're all just sort of coping with it in different ways. And some people embrace it and some people reject it. So I don't know if I really believe that at my core, but it's one of my sort of, it's like one of my base fears that I have to confront, I guess.
And I think this kind of links back to the sort of challenge of what does it mean to be, anti-capitalist in any serious sense.
Yep.
And the necessarily dialectical relationship an individual has to take to what does it mean to kind of think post-capitalism. Fisher's final lectures are on post-capitalist desire. And it's desire that I think Fisher was right in identifying as, do we really want what we say that we want. He uses the very famous example at the beginning of the Post-Capitalist Desire lectures. He uses a super famous example. On British TV, there's this insanely popular current affairs comedy panel show called Have I Got News for You? And during Occupy London, when there was people occupying one of the central districts of the city, a Conservative MP was on the show, and she talked about how these protesters were complaining about capitalism on their iPhones. They were hypocrites.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be very easy to just go, well, capitalism is a totalizing system. But Fisher goes, actually, we have to have a good answer to this.
Yeah.
We can't just be like, you can't resort to that Matt Bohr's 4-panel comic, but you live in society of the man popping out of the well. And he said, actually, we have to reckon with the fact that capitalism has integrated itself not simply on an economic level into our lives, but into the kind of psychological or psychoanalytic foundations of desire itself. Now, the solution to that is not to say that desire is bad, but actually to understand how desire can be channeled and organized and oriented towards a post-capitalist horizon.
Yeah, and there's this, so that cartoon is one very common response to this. Another common response is to sort of reflexively say that capitalism is not responsible for that technological development because, like, for instance, the internet was developed by the U.S. government. And it becomes a sort of shallow game of, like, socialism needs to take credit for this. Capitalism can't have the credit for this kind of technological development. It becomes a sort of pissing contest, which I increasingly find to be very tiresome.
Yes. So the solution is not to be like, scoreboard, look at how much better socialism is. The solution is to go, okay, what is it that people actually want?
Yes.
What is it that the iPhone gives us? How does capitalism use our desires to maintain our own investment in it? Right? Fisher talks elsewhere about our insertion at the level of desire into the circuits of capitalism. Right? The zombies that capitalism creates are us. We are involved psychologically, as well as materially, as well as economically, because that's how ideology functions. Fisher's point towards the end of the K-punk collection is this possibility of a kind of psychedelic acid communism, something that recognizes the utopian impulse, the desire for something that is genuine connection, a genuine kind of humanism, a genuine sort of relationship with one another. That is, we're offered a kind of, a good example would be social media, right? We're offered social media as a capitalist tool on the promise that it will actually connect us. And you can go, well, people just wanted to be mad online. No, generally, I think in its first generation of adoption, people were excited about the possibility of a kind of worldwide connectivity, and it was posited in very naive and utopian terms, but I do think it was there. But what we're actually given with that desire is something very different. But the desire itself is still something that's latent, right? It's still something that's there. So again, the solution is not to be like, well, actually, if you look at my itemized list of the achievements, you'll see that socialism is up 5 on capitalism.
Right.
But we actually have to think, how do we not tell people that they're desiring incorrectly, because what psychoanalyst would do that? But to go, actually, here's what your desire is actually for. Desire is always a displaced thing, right? You end up on Twitter sharing kind of boomer memes about QAnon when really what you wanted was a chance to feel like you could be politically and culturally connected to something bigger than oneself.
Yeah, and we should honor that desire. That's like I think that's a very healthy impulse.
Yeah.
It's just not always expressed in ways that usher in this age of connectivity that we, I guess it's one of the lost futures, right?
Yeah, exactly. This idea that a genuinely utopian future would necessarily be post-capitalist, because capitalism does not create plenitude. It doesn't create abundance. It actually forms an artificial hold upon it. And this connects, I think, directly back to what we were talking about work, right?
Yep.
And I should say thank you to you and to the other very, very talented people who lent their voices to the video.
Oh yeah, it was fun.
It must be nice to be in the position of like rejecting somebody
for once in my life,
rather than constantly being the one who gets the rejection.
Exactly.
I thought it would appeal to people. But like the whole point of work is people want something that is fulfilling. They've done studies that show once your salary raises past a certain level, you're not any happier than you would be if you made more money. The majority of people anyway. What people want generally is the ability to secure means of life, a home, food, shelter, healthcare, and to do something that is meaningful, uses their skills, and in some sense contributes to something larger than themselves. That's the promise of work, right? The ability to make a positive difference to something larger than ourselves. Capitalism offers us that, but capitalist alienation actually ensures that desire, that psychoanalytic impulse within us. Marx says that the thing about humans that distinguishes us from any other creature is our ability to remake the world around us. Mm-hmm. That desire is alienated away from us, which is why work is so fundamentally unsatisfying, because the impulse of, I want to use what skills that I have, I want to be able to provide for myself or for the people that I care about or my community or family. All of that are fairly understandable desires, but they are alienated away from ourselves by the structures of work that are offered as the means to meet that desire in the first place.
Do you buy into this Hegelian idea that alienation is sort of inevitable in life, and that our particular form of alienation under capitalism is just one of these forms of alienation? Like, I guess at the root of the idea is if you are, remaking the world through production, it never actually turns out as you intend, right? And that is kind of the root of alienation. Am I making sense?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess really the only honest answer is that we don't know, do we? If commodity production has been the way in which we've been allowed to impact upon the world, to exert that creative faculty, contributing to get to capitalist systems, then we don't really know if there would still be a kind of an alienation if we were in a kind of post-capitalist world. I mean, almost certainly there probably would be in some degree and in some regard, because the satisfaction of desire is a kind of very complex psychological question. So I guess I suspect so, but I think we would have more resources and more ability to deal with alienation and to understand it than we do at the moment.
Yeah, and I also think it's like a issue of magnitude, right? Like that would be a more tolerable form of alienation, I would like to think,
and something that would be more integrated into practices of living.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, so it'd be something that could be not remedied, but would be something that would be understood and kind of confronted. Maybe it would involve spending a lot more time thinking about psychoanalysis, but who knows?
Well, I was going to ask, how do you sort of reconcile sort of Marx's criticisms that go under the header of like utopian socialism with, trying to embrace something like Fisher's notion of acid communism, where he is a bit more sympathetic to like a utopian perspective?
Well, I think what's important again is this what does it mean to hope for something, basically, is the kind of question that I feel like you're asking, right? What does it really mean to square a unflinchingly honest account of the depravities and dangers and horrors of capitalism now, with the potential of a post-capitalist future that would be a genuine time of what Fisher calls red plenty. And I think the honest answer is, with great difficulty, that there has to be a forward projection of something, right? Even if it's very provisional. Mm-hmm. And there is a good utopian or utopian inflected strain of Marxist thought, which I think is very important and is very influential on me, particularly people like the German Marxist Ernst Bloch, who wrote about the utopian impulse in all culture. There was a desire for the manifestation of the not yet, as he called it. And he said that hope can be disappointed, but you can hope for something and you can hope towards something. And that requires us to sort of project something of ourselves forward into the present. There's that communists are basically are essentially time travelers. You know, we've arrived dislocated from capitalist history with an eye on a potential future. But really, the best formulation of this is still Gramsci's, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. There is nothing to hope for if we don't understand fully the kind of problems that we face. And if we are naive utopians, then we never will be able to understand the problems that we face and overcome them.
Well, that was a perfect answer. You nailed that.
I was about to say, that feels very unsatisfying. It feels, because when you're talking about something that is not yet, when you're talking about the possibility of a utopian future, what people tend to want is something kind of concrete. And that's the very opposite of what you can give them. Yeah.
It's the most satisfying answer you can offer.
Yeah.
I think.
But my line on it is that utopianism is good. There are people who would say it's dangerously idealist. And I often think that a dash of utopianism is the kind of missing element of a lot of like online leftist critique.
Yes.
So Bloch talks about it as the warm and the cold stream of Marxist thought. So the cold stream is the kind of economic critique, the ruthless critique of everything that exists, the critique of political economy, the exploration of capitalism's kind of nebulous influence. The warm stream is that of him, of people like Marcuse, of proto-communists like the Protestant theologian Thomas Münzner, where it is utopian and often idealistic, much more artistically inclined, and is gesturing towards a better future. And I think I don't sort of mean to I've just started making YouTube videos, which I find really rewarding. But I think sometimes a lot of online videos that I've seen are sort of like, here is this problem, and this problem exists in a way that you haven't thought about. The classic one is like, here is why X show or X movie is bad. It's really bad, and it's bad for these reasons. Mm-hmm. And those are valid, but I think what's missing is to go, here is something within this show which actually gestures to something beyond the bad present and the possibility of a better future. And those two things are not in contradiction, because any text, any work of art, Bloch wrote about like fairy stories and rhymes that children would sing and poetry. Any text has within it something that could be a diagnosis of the terrors of our present, but could also be a kind of a foretaste, a foretelling of the that which is not at hand, the that which is not yet revealed in our current present. The great Blochian kind of an analogy for this is where he looks at the Parthenon, and he says that we could go, well, it's a symbol of a violent and uncivilized and dangerous civilization, and it's good that it's gone, and it's just it's a piece of history that doesn't tell us anything anymore. But he says actually, it's how we interpret it changes through history, and it can also point towards something that has not arrived even now in our present. So I think, if anything, we should make. Again, I'm not suggesting just sort of like naive utopianism. This idea of like, oh, everything's going to be fine in the end. But I would say that actually you need to understand where we've come from, which is done through the method of historical materialism. We need to understand where we are, which is done through class analysis, and we need to understand the possibility of where we could go, which is through revolutionary class struggle towards a post-capitalist future. So a diagnosis without any hope is a very bitter pill to swallow, and kind of just a hopeful thing without any understanding of just how difficult things might be is naive and sort of useless.
Yeah, I've been leaning towards the diagnosis with no hope, unfortunately, but that's my own thing I need to grapple with, because I think it is self-analysis is tricky, right?
Yeah, totally.
But shifting to more like in a more immediate sort of class analysis type question, I'm a bit perplexed by the fact that like the stock market seems to have recovered so quickly from the crisis spurred by the pandemic, which I know we can attribute to the generation of fictitious capital, and that's, of course, it's not reflected in the everyday experience of most people. I don't think people are feeling as though the economy has recovered, but it does seem to be the case, at least in the U.S., that the labor market is tightening, the quality of those jobs notwithstanding. But, at any rate, it seems to me, if you were to ask me a year ago versus now, I would be very surprised with the rate at which capitalism seems to have adapted to this crisis. Do you think there's maybe a tendency with some people on the left to underestimate this ability for capitalism to adapt and evolve based on any given crisis?
Yes, absolutely. This was the whole point of Fisher writing Capitalist Realism, right? This idea of the 2008, the great kind of financial crisis that affected most of Europe, the UK, and America, and was a real sort of crack in the kind of neoliberal consensus of how economics was supposed to function. But Fisher's answer, and I think it's really the only honest answer, is that one, capitalism is resilient precisely because it is a psychological, emotive, and ideological force as well as an economic one. We are invested in it. Not just in the creation of fictitious capital or in the generation of line going up stonks, but we're invested in it because we believe that it promises something. And I think there's a danger in going every moment of crisis is the end, because that turns you into somebody who will just not be taken seriously. But crises, as capitalists know, are opportunities. And capitalists tend to be extremely good at seizing opportunities. I still think the best analysis of this is Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, which is super readable and still tragically incredibly relevant to what happens in the moment of capitalist crisis. Is there is the necessary creative destruction, but there is also the kind of redeployment of capital forces in certain places and the encouragement for new areas to emerge. It's no coincidence, I think, that you had things like the massive growth in the bubble of NFTs that happened just in the last year, which has already reached a point where people go, oh yeah, none of this is really real. This is just a massive scam to create artificial scarcity, which drives up value.
Yep.
There was that amazing conversation with somebody. Actually, one of the Winklevoss twins got into this big conversation about NFTs where they could not really explain how it was just different from a JPEG. And because no, it's a joke. It's something that you can own and you can look at whatever you want. And it's like, well, I can do that anyway.
Yep.
So I think, not every crisis, not every kind of moment of instability is a genuine crisis, and not every crisis is a kind of transformative event. but all of them are useful and important and should be paid attention to. If anything, I think probably what's much more worthy of time and attention and interest is the uprisings across many American cities last year, predominantly led by black people and people of color that spread actually worldwide. And me and Labour Kyle made a video about riots, trying to kind of make the point that the neoliberal framing of them as just homo economicus, that extremely racist discourse of looters, was completely insufficient. And actually, it's much more important to think that the masses have an agency to act. And even if it's not complete, even if it isn't going to, overthrow capitalism in one weekend, it's any kind of uprising, any kind of mass of people onto the streets is something that people should be paying attention to and thinking about very carefully. So, I think I would agree that like people have the tendency to either under or overestimate every moment of instability.
Yeah, and I like what you said about the riots. There's a sort of nascent democratic potential that exists within any given society, given the right conditions. And if that is truly unlocked, it would make the Capitol riots look like, kindergarten, right?
Yeah.
And that has happened throughout history. So there's no reason to think it's impossible.
Exactly.
This is a more general kind of question. I was introduced to your work through Twitter, which I think is where you initially developed as a sort of online educator in the field of literary theory, right? Mm-hmm. Twitter is often decried as the hell site, right? But you seem to have consistently evaded some of the most toxic elements of online discourse, at least in my opinion. Do you have any tips on how to use the site in a healthy way?
I think having a purpose really helps. Thinking about it as like an educational space or as a space. Lately, what I really want to do is I want to talk more about books on there is really important. I've been keeping a thread of everything that I read over the course of the year. And when I reach various milestones, what I'm going to do is kind of do little review mini threads of like, actually, here's what I found. Has been really helpful. And I also think Twitter is not a place for conversation. Increasingly, I think. I've made really good friends there, but I realized once the account grew beyond a certain size, it was sort of impossible to reply to pretty much everybody. And so a lot of things, I don't see them as conversations because it's literally impossible to have a conversation with 5,000 people. You can't do that. And if you try, it will either make you extremely angry or very depressed. Parasocial relationships cut both ways is the other thing as well. People always talk about like you shouldn't kind of look up to or form these parasocial bonds with people whose content you enjoy. But I also think if you are someone who makes content, I've written a huge amount. I've done lots of educational work on Twitter. I've now got the podcast. But if you think of the audience in a parasocial way, you won't have a good time either. So I guess I don't know. I think a lot of discourse is avoidable if you choose not to engage and actually have a kind of positive project that you want to engage with. So like I talk about the things that I like and I think are important and the ideas and books that I think make a difference, irregardless of whether people are discoursing about, some YouTube drama or like whatever kind of hot take is circulating.
Right.
So it's like I will happily talk about Frederick Jameson and Mark Fisher and Ernst Bloch or Rosa Luxemburg or Angela Davis, not because I think that they fit into the kind of hot take generation economy, but because actually there's a really great short piece at the beginning of the K-Punk collection where Fisher talks about the books that have been really formative on him as a thinker and reader. And he says that like there are periods in his life which are marked by a kind of depression and an intellectual, arid state. And those are moments when you kind of, he says, when you lose fidelity to the thinkers who are formative upon you, who help orient you to the world. And he lists people like J.G. Ballard or Spinoza. And I read that and I was sort of like, I get what that means. And that's what I try and do. I sort of like, I have certain thinkers or certain books or certain ideas which orientate my understanding of the world and the way in which I try and approach things and understand things. And when I stop paying attention to those, when I stop paying attention to my own kind of positive intellectual scaffold, you get drawn into the hell site. You get drawn into the negative space of Twitter. And I think Twitter for me is at its best when I am using the things which are most important to me and the thinkers and ideas and books which are most important to me to help me to try and understand the world in a kind of positive way. And I don't mean just in an optimistic way, but in a constructive way. I guess I don't know if that's good advice or not, but it seems to have worked so far.
I think it's good advice. You have a very focused approach, which is kind of has a certain defensive barrier against the void that is Twitter. I get sucked into the void. I look into it and it stares back,
Yeah, because it will, right? It's an attention sink. And it doesn't always work, right? I have days where I get mad online, and have to log off for a bit. But at its best, it's like, something that you see happening, or something that you go, you read something, or you watch something, or you want to respond to something, and you go, I have these tools available to me, and these are tools that I've used and found useful, and these tools are things which I think can contribute something positive. Not a universal or complete picture. I never claim that. I honestly think that my range of interests and influences is pretty limited, but they're ones that allow you to kind of do something and go, actually, here are ways of understanding things. And really the whole point is to go, here is a new way of thinking about something. And that's what I've tried to do with the podcast, Horror Vanguard. And this is what I'm trying to do with the YouTube videos, because Twitter, like YouTube, has its own grammar. The video essay has its own grammatical structure. Posting has its own grammar, which is very disconnected from actual systems of grammar. And so what I'm trying to do is to go, right, how do you put a positive interpretation? How do you put this into the grammar of the form that you want to use in a way that it is not just another post or another video essay?
Well, that's a very thoughtful approach, and I also think it's a sign of the times that maybe the things that you talk about 10, 20 years ago, it would be very niche, and it still is a bit niche. But I do think it is a sign of the times that you have a pretty large following, relatively. I mean, in my opinion.
And I think that comes with kind of. It would be very easy to just be like, let's chase the numbers. Let's see what kind of high score we can rack up. On somebody else's stream, right. I described Twitter as a video game where you're trying to get the highest score you can. But really, what I would like it to be is a space in which I don't want to fall into that way of thinking. Although, as I say, I frequently do. Because it's fun and immediately rewarding, and the serotonin machine go burr. But at its best, you want it to be a space where you go, actually, here is a place in which I can explore a few ideas and try and put forward something that might be useful.
For sure. You have a pretty impressive reading list for this year. Do you have any insights or tips on how to maintain good reading habits?
I try and make it very low stakes. So I think quite a lot of people go, oh, well, I must read at this time and for this amount of time. And if I stop reading, then I kind of failed somehow. But very basically, I have a house full of books, and I tend to have books pretty much everywhere I might be during the day. So it's like, if I'm traveling somewhere, I will take a book and I will read a couple of pages. I try and read every day rather than having regular set times for it. It also helps that, it's also part of my job. So I'm not including in that thread anything that I've read for work. Mm-hmm. So it's just stuff that I was in a meeting which finished an hour early, and I was like, well, I have a book in my bag, so I'll just sit. Before I'm going to go, I'm just going to sit. I'll just read for a bit, and then I can head off. So my only real advice is don't be afraid to stop reading something if you're bored by it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of books, or particularly with academic books or nonfiction books, where it's like, I will read the first chapter and then I'll be like, I kind of see where this is going, so I might just flick through the rest, and I may not ever read the whole thing cover to cover because I don't want to put the time in. So a lot of the stuff that I've read this year has been stuff which is fairly short, and I've been able to just read it like a few pages at a time. There's been a few things which are a little bit longer. One of the best things I've read so far this year is Alexander Zevin's intellectual biography of The Economist magazine, which, if you want to understand just how evil British capitalism really is, do check it out. But generally I've tried to keep things which are short and have kind of well-organized chapters, just to try and make things easy for myself. Don't put pressure on yourself, basically, is what I would say. When you go, I have to read this, you're kind of setting yourself up to fail. And it's like, read what grabs your attention, read eclectically, and don't be afraid to just put stuff back down if it's not interesting you. I've been reading a lot of stuff about the history of the FBI because I'm making a video about it. That's been really fun. So having ways of making it more engaging for myself helps too.
So that does map onto my experience as well. There was a time when I had like a little checklist of things I need to do every day, sort of like a Benjamin Franklin type roadmap for self-improvement. Very liberal in hindsight. And one of my things was, read an hour a day, which I think is a reasonable goal, but it also does kind of put pressure on you, especially when, I have a full-time job. I have other things going on. And I think also, for me personally, it's like, I think I'm still infected with the Protestant work ethic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I feel like when I pick up a book and I don't finish it, there's failure there.
Yeah.
And that comes with a certain kind of shame. And then you get into a shame spiral, and it makes you not want to pick up any more books, I think is, so your advice is, I think that's great advice, to keep it low stakes. Don't put too much pressure on yourself.
Yeah. And, every academic has a whole load of books where they've read like the introduction and conclusion and one chapter, or they've read like the intro and will maybe go back to it over the years. And like the meaning of books changes for you as you go back to them. I really struggled to read up until Christmas, thanks to COVID, thanks to everything else that was going on. Like my concentration just vanished.
Yeah.
And so what really helped was going back to a series of books that I really love, and I've loved for a very long time, which is China Miéville's Baslag trilogy, which are fantastic socialist fantasy fiction. And maybe some of the best fantasy of the 21st century, in my opinion. And I sat down and read them all, and suddenly, found myself they're 500 pages long each. But so I would read, 2 or 3 pages, and that'd be it that day. But the next day I would read a little bit more. And yeah, keeping it low stakes, not being afraid to go, this doesn't interest me. Especially if it's a book that we're told that we should, you should have read.
Right.
That's a very dangerous phrase because it kills all kind of motivation. And I get loads of like DMs and messages about this of like, oh, what should I read? And I'm like, I don't know what you should read. Read what is interesting.
Yeah.
What's much more important, I think, is to figure out what are the things that you're interested in. You know, if you're a historian, there's no point me going, well, you should read this book of Lacanian literary criticism, you know, because you should read it. That doesn't make any sense. So I think just pursuing your own interests and not being afraid to go, actually, this doesn't work for me, or even this doesn't work for me right now, and just put it back on the shelf and be willing to come back to it one day, is a much more effective way of keeping yourself going.
That's basically what happened with me and David Graeber's Debt. The first 5,000 years. I got about 150 pages into that, and then I just felt burned out on it. Yeah,
absolutely. But it's fine to just go, all right, I'll come back to that later.
Right. Yeah. So it's an unfortunate fact that we need to use corporate platforms like Twitter and YouTube in order to reach people. So with that in mind, what sort of challenges are you experiencing as like someone who like an online educator? What sort of challenges do you face in 2021 with these platforms?
Well, I don't know. I think you probably have more insight into this than me, but I think with YouTube, the big challenge is to stop yourself becoming a numbers person.
Yep.
Because like when I first decided I was going to start making YouTube videos, I joined a few kind of subreddits for new YouTubers. Because
I did that too.
You know, just so you can kind of see what everyone else is working on. And I sort of look at them now with sort of like abstract fascination, because they're so numbers driven that they have sort of forgotten why it was that they wanted to start making videos in the first place. Because making these videos, like any other kind of creative activity, is in some measure incommensurable with a capitalist exchange. Right? You're not making products that you can sell easily. If you're making good stuff, or if you're making stuff with kind of sincerity, you're trying to make, in some small way, something that could approach the status of art, right? Or art criticism, which is at its best a kind of subgenre of art. So the big challenge is to stop yourself going, why didn't this one do as well? or why did this one do really well and then the others didn't? I think the big thing is like audience and metric is not a reflection of quality and content. You know, just because something is watched millions and millions of times does not make it good. And I actually think it's a very capitalist thing to reduce markers of quality down to audience. Something that drives me wild when you talk about film criticism is people who would go, oh, well, the Marvel movies are objectively good because they have a big audience.
Right.
And this is something Marx talks about with the kind of the dissolution of all value. So all you're left with is quantitative comparison, right? This product is better because it's cheaper. Or this product is better because it's more expensive. That's the only metric of value that we're allowed to have. And that gets transposed into social media platforms, into YouTube. This video is better because it has more views, or this video is bad because it has loads of dislikes. And I think the big challenge, if you want to create educational content, if you want to, create criticism or comment, or again, even art in some way, is to stop caring about that stuff. But that's really difficult to do because the entire platform is geared towards making you care about it, because that's how they turn you into something that can generate revenue. I don't know. Does that kind of chime with your experience? You've got way more experience on YouTube than I do.
It does. It is something I grapple with all the time. But what you're saying, it generally does track in my experience. It's especially problematic in cases where you find yourself on the brink of like, could I make a living doing this?
Yeah.
That would be much better than having a day job, right? Or you would think, right?
Yeah.
One would think. But once you get into that mindset and you see what performs well and what doesn't perform well, and you start asking yourself, why didn't this video do well? What am I doing wrong? It's very easy to kind of drive yourself nuts.
Oh, completely.
Yeah, and just a little anecdote to kind of support that. I started streaming more in the past few months, and I noticed that my subscriber count was going down. I noticed that overall viewership was going down, and there's some contradictions there, because I was also noticing that at times my revenue would go up because I would get super chats, but the overall trend for my channel was going down. I was like, at a certain point, I was losing like a couple hundred subscribers a week, which is kind of scary.
Yeah.
And I was asking myself, do people just not like me unfiltered? Do I need to have a script in front of me? That could be part of it. Is it the subject matter? That could be part of it. You start asking all these questions, and it changes how you approach something that you maybe once loved. And I still do love to make. I still love making YouTube videos, but because of the way, because of how I'm situated in this world, it is constantly a game of like, I feel like the platform is gaslighting me. and then I watched a video after all this, because I was like, do people just don't like me? Is that what's going on? I watched a video that basically their experience, and it was totally like unrelated to what I do in terms of like video essays or like analysis or whatever. It was like a gaming channel, and they were saying, oh, it's so I noticed I started streaming more, and the channel's not performing as well, and I'm actually like hemorrhaging subscribers, which is the same exact thing was happening to me. And the reason for that is the algorithm looks at the total watch time, and the way people interact with streams is fundamentally different from the way people interact with a scripted YouTube video. Because in the case of a scripted long form video, if you look at my analytics, the what is it called? Audience retention is relatively high. People will watch like 20 minutes of, a 30-minute video, which is pretty good on average, right? And that's not how people interact with streams necessarily. Oftentimes people just sort of pop in, they'll ask a question, they'll interact with the chat a little bit, but it's like they don't stick around for the full 2 hours that you're streaming. And if you leave that video up, people don't necessarily watch a full 2 hours of you sort of talking about different things. It's not exactly focused, and you're interacting with the chat at various points. You might be talking about something that interests them at one point, but then they'll drop off because you totally change the subject. So the nature of streaming is just fundamentally different, but YouTube's algorithm treats it the same way it treats scripted videos. Yeah. And so this whole time, I was like, I was really sort of internalizing this. I was like, what am I doing wrong? I guess I have to make scripted videos because people don't like watching me in like a stream format. And it turns out it's just a sort of a function of how YouTube treats streamed content,
Yeah, and I think this is the thing, right? Just by seeing the response in metrics, you automatically go, oh, well, something must be wrong with me.
Right.
It becomes an individualized thing rather than the fact that, we're trying to do things on a fairly opaque platform. We don't really know how a lot of it works. I looked at the analytics page, my YouTube channel. I don't really like to look at it, mostly because I don't really understand it. And two, I feel like trying to understand it would be it would eventually make it much harder for me to think, what would be an interesting way of making this video rather than going, what would be a video that does really well?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to do. The next thing that I'm working on, I'm trying to do something which will be an interesting exploration of a text that I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention in the kind of like left or leftist cultural commentary, cultural critique YouTube. But I don't want to be like, oh, how do I make sure this is going to do well? I think the question has to be like, how do I make something which will be interesting regardless of how many people see it?
That's a good philosophy. And that's what I try to adhere to as well. But it gets increasingly difficult. I will say that.
Yeah.
As you get more and more subscribers, it gets increasingly difficult.
Yeah, because suddenly you go, I could do this for a living. Wouldn't that be cool? But then you're suddenly you're not employed. You're an independent contractor. You're a precarious freelancer who just happens to work for YouTube.
Exactly. Yeah. And then there's all these incentives to be like, well, you need to diversify your revenue streams. You need to have merchandise. You need to have a Patreon. You need to do this and that and this.
And that brings us back to the whole point of, the ultimate plasticity of the self under neoliberalism. You are a brand, so diverse. You are a vertically integrated corporation. So you need to diversify. You need your podcast, you need your YouTube, you need your Twitch stream, you need your merchandise, and all of the majority of that revenue you won't make. Obviously, it'll go to the platforms that we are independent contractors for. But there'll be enough to kind of keep us on the hook, as it were. So, yes, it can become a job. I totally get that. And I think, but also it comes with all of the alienated problems of work generally.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I'll change my profile description on Twitter to a vertically integrated corporation. See how people like that.
Rather than single-handedly bringing back new metal.
That's right. I am still going to do that, though.
But yeah, that's the problem of work on the capital. Like people go, oh, well, if you make YouTube videos for a living, then that's a very privileged position. And in a sense, yes, but also it's something that shares a lot of the same problems of work as many other careers. And I suppose it's worth like the whole problem of education is trying to do education in an unalienated fashion in a capitalist world, right? Because education doesn't mesh easily with capitalism. It's not something that you can necessarily just buy.
Right.
It's something that emerges in a much more kind of interesting and complicated way. So trying to do that online, it demands a kind of intentionality and being aware of the limitations of what that online work can do. Like some of the best emails I've ever gotten was actually one that I got years ago, but I remember ever since, was a guy who was a nurse who used to work a lot of nights, and he followed me on Twitter, and he would read the stuff that I had kind of posted about whilst he was working the night shift. And he was like, it's really helpful. It's helped me understand quite a lot of things about my own situation. And I was like, that's all I can do. All I can do is go, here is a potential tool for you.
Yep.
Here is a potential way of thinking. Here is a potential way of understanding your own lived social reality. The understanding and the knowledge of it comes from them. I didn't do anything. All I did was talk about the things that were interesting to me. But he was the one who now had a better understanding of his situation and the world that he lived in, because he'd done the same thing.
That's the best thing you can possibly hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will say that. That's and anytime I talk about these things in a public facing way, there are inevitably like a bunch of nice people who say, like, for what it's worth, here's what your videos mean to me. And it's like, that is the best possible thing you could say. It's just, yeah, exactly.
Because as I say, I think the really good thing about doing kind of online critique or theory online is like, it's very small. It's a very, very small contribution. Twitter and YouTube or even our podcast, it's like the platforms will try and make you think it's the most important thing ever because it's about generating those bigger numbers.
Yep.
But really all it is standing on a great digital coastline, throwing a bottle into the sea with a note rack inside it. That's all it is. And you hope that over there on the other side of the horizon, there are people who might find it and they might read it and they might find it useful. But it is far better, I think, to have put it out there than it never to have arrived with them at all. And there's so little that you can do about it. All you can do is drop it in and go, this might be useful to someone out there in some small way to help you understand the world that you find yourself living in. And it's quite a beautiful thing, actually, this idea of like, I made a video about the video game What Remains of Edith Finch. And got a message from someone who said, I played it years ago. I didn't really think about it that much, but you've really helped me understand that this is kind of an important thing, dealing with the inevitability of death. And I was like, okay, I don't know you. I have no real connection with you other than this kind of nebulous kind of echo through digital space. But that's a very fragile, contingent, kind of insignificant thing. Despite the fact that I could go, well, I've got this big following. Look at the nice things people have said about me. It's a very small thing, but it is a small thing with which has meaning, and it's worth kind of clinging on to that.
And it is important to acknowledge how small of a role we play, because I think once there are various points in my sort of online life where I've kind of let my ego I've kind of like let it run away a little bit too much, and I end up making mistakes or things I regret later on. I had this whole kind of like, I think the initial idea was good. I was going to kind of reveal the spectacle of online debate. And so I watched a debate between like two major online debaters who I feel as though if I mention their names, it will be sort of like the villain in Harry Potter type thing. So we can't say that. In other words, I'll end up contributing to the feedback loop again, and I don't want to do that. But that's essentially what happened. I was like trying to criticize them, and at various points, this was a live stream, I sort of got angry because certain things they were saying were angering me. And that sort of, and so I unwittingly contributed to the thing that I set out to expose and critique. So it's a very tricky thing, navigating these platforms.
Yeah. I think
while keeping your ego in check.
I think that's the thing, right? I think that's the big thing. To in a way, working in academia is quite good at that, because you see very clear. Like, I'm surrounded by people who are so much smarter than I am all day, every day. So you constantly run into the limits of your own knowledge on a regular basis. And you have to reckon with the fact that you know very little. And one day, if I'm really good, I will know that I know very little. I will know that I have very little knowledge. Just constantly having to realize it. Having a kind of accurate assessment of what it means to kind of be online, I think, is really useful, because the whole big online debaters would say that what they do is the most important thing. What they do is incredibly important, as with all of the people. But as you said, it's this self-sustaining feedback loop where the importance doesn't feed outwards into the world or to kind of help people understand their social conditions. Not really. What it feeds back into is this never-ending Ouroboros of discourse. It's the machine keeps going round, and it is self-contained and almost impervious in many ways to kind of serious criticism. So I think having having an attitude of like, this is a very small contribution. I'm trying to do something very deliberate and very, very small and very focused, and it may not ever work. That's the other thing. I'm in the middle of doing a research study at the moment. And one of the very first things that we had to kind of sit down and talk about was, what if we don't find what we're expecting? Mm-hmm. What if this fails? What if this just doesn't work? And the only kind of answer we come up with is, well, we will have learned something new. We will have learned that we were wrong, and that's a valuable thing in and of itself. It will be really embarrassing, but we might have learned something new as well. So yeah, I think you're right, because of this idea of our own personal investment, which is a very semiotically charged word, right? Our own personal investment into the brand, into the success of one of our subsidiaries. It's very easy for that to become a kind of an ego thing. But I think having that understanding that actually what we're trying to do is very small. We're just trying to give people tools, helps keep that in check, if only a little bit.
I fully agree. So I have, you've been very generous with your time. I have one more question. Sort of an open-ended question. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that theology plays in your studies, and if you're comfortable, the role that religion plays in your life. Because I'm coming at this as someone who went through a very edgy new atheist phase. Fortunately, come out the other end, understanding how foolish it was to really get trapped in that sort of mindset. I want to introduce people who are maybe a bit, I don't know what's the word, a bit still rooted in that sort of new atheistic mindset. Because I'm still an atheist. I think there's a certain segment on the left that still kind of clings to the idea that, like, in order to effectively usher in a better world, you need to sort of abandon all notions of religion, and you need to like criticize people who are religious, which I think is totally backwards in hindsight,
Yeah.
So that was a really long-winded way of asking the question. Sorry.
No, totally. Well, I think what I'll just kind of keep things fairly straightforward, which is like, I work in a theology and religious studies department. I've written for the Institute for Christian Socialism, and I'm going to be writing for them in the future. And I tend not to talk too directly about my own kind of personal religious beliefs. But what I will say is that the idea of creating a better world is one which is in some ways inextricably bound up within a kind of theological discourse. It can be secularized or a-religious, but any sort of utopia is about bringing into being something which is not yet manifest or materially present. When it comes to like what should non-religious or atheist leftists read, the only thing I would suggest is something like Herbert McCabe's The Class Struggle and Christian Love. McCabe was a very famous Catholic theologian and Dominican, maybe one of the best writers on the scholastic theologian Thomas Aquinas in living memory, but he essentially writes very interestingly about socialist politics and the necessity of class struggle in order to achieve socialist politics. I think the big question that like lots of people have is one of like materialism, right? And there are kind of interesting philosophical responses you can give. I remember Revolutionary Left Radio had the Magnificast on a little while ago to talk about liberation theology, and the Magnificast is a podcast hosted by two Christian leftists. They said, well, we could talk the philosophical answer, but practically on the ground, doesn't really matter. This materialism question of like, oh, if you're a communist, if you're a socialist, you have to be an atheist. Doesn't really matter for the vast majority of, if you go into a Catholic church and tell them you go into the right Catholic church and tell them that you're a communist, they'll go, well, obviously, of course you would. Of course you are. It just means you pay attention to the world. But I think, like everything, religion and especially religious practices should be subject to the ruthless criticism of all that exists. But that is not criticism as a negation necessarily, but it can be criticism as a constructive addition to practice, right? The history of liberation theology is full of worker priests, of priests as revolutionaries, as priests who have been integral into organizing throughout Latin America, just off the top of my head. Religious communities were helping organize workers for decades now. Communist Party meetings in the Deep South in the 1920s in America used to open with prayers, because this idea of having communists and communities struggle against the KKK and other racists was not in contradiction with a faith that pointed towards something liberatory. Essentially what I'm saying, it's very complicated. The best analogy I've ever heard about this is from an Australian academic theologian called Roland Bohr, who has written extensively on the history of Marxism and Christianity, where he says that Marxism and theology are like two antagonistic lovers, occasionally having furious rows and occasionally furiously fucking. That's because there is a long tradition of leftists learning from and paying attention to religious organizations. And the opposite should be true as well. If you're listening to this, if you are not someone who is religiously inclined at all, and you don't really understand what religious leftism might look like, there is the famous essay that I would definitely recommend checking out is Herbert McCabe's The Class Struggle and Christian Love, because it makes the point that actually it's written for a Christian audience, but it says, if the Christian response is not to decide whether there is a class struggle, that's just simply a fact of living under capitalism. The Christian response is to decide on which side will you fight, which side will you participate in the class struggle. It's a really interesting and very thought-provoking essay. And what I'd say is there is a long and very complicated story that's unfolded, arguably since the Reformation, of revolutionary transformations of the world, revolutionary and often violent revolutionary responses to injustice that have had a religious tenor to them. I don't know. Does that work as a? I'm aware that's a very vague answer, because
I don't think it's vague.
If I tried to be exhaustive, we'd be here for another hour.
I mean, it's clear you're very knowledgeable on it, but I don't think that was overly vague. Giving viewers and giving myself just a few little tidbits, or like. Yeah, that essay you mentioned, I'm going to have to check that out.
Yeah, I will send you a link.
Yeah, this is an area that is increasingly interesting to me. But yeah, like I said, you've been very generous with your time. This was awesome. Thanks so much for coming on. Can you tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. If you come say hello, I am the LitCritGuy on pretty much everything. I am also the co-host of the podcast Horror Vanguard, where we talk about leftist politics, theory, and horror movies, which, after all, the biggest and spookiest monster is capitalism itself. I am usually over on Twitter talking, hopefully, about books, and if it's a bad day, dunking on people, which I shouldn't do, but I do occasionally. And you can find me on YouTube, where I'm aiming to try and put out a pretty substantial video once a month. And if you like those, you can help me pay for them by finding me on patreon.com/thelitcritguy as well.
Excellent. We'll leave it at that.